don't know if this is a dangerous joke to share, given what's going to happen after this service, but when have I ever been shy? There will be a meeting of the board immediately after the service, announced the pastor. After the close of the service, the church board gathered at the back of the auditorium for the announced meeting, but there was a stranger in their midst, a visitor who had never attended their church before. "My friend," said the pastor, "didn't you understand that this is the meeting of the board?" "Yes," said the visitor, "and after today's sermon, I suppose I'm just about as bored as anyone else who came to this meeting." Ah, the universal truths of church. So, in case you haven't been keeping score, we've now covered the first half of Lessons in Truth. This was, as you recall, when I started this series in January, I said, I think we'll finish this in a month. And what I discovered for myself, and I hope you're discovering, those of you who have been following along, reading Lessons in Truth on your own or in the group with Ronnie, that there is just an endless amount of wisdom to absorb from Dr. Katie. Well, I want to just do a quick review so we can set up the second half of the book. Because in the first half of the book, what she's basically doing is defining terms. And of course, she's inviting us to adopt the practices as we saw in the chapters on denial and affirmation. But the second half of the book, she is going to lead us into the direct experience of what she has been talking about in the first half of the book. So we started in the very first chapter by acknowledging the nature of the belief system that we're born with, we're born into, and that we are seeking to transcend as true students. This belief system is what Dr. Katie calls our subconscious assumption that the world we were born into was eternal and unchangeable and de facto all there is. But somehow, for those of us in this room and many other human beings across the planet, we sooner or later discovered that this world of the flesh, as she calls it, the world of the flesh and the things of the flesh no longer satisfies. And as our unhappiness with our assumptions pushes more and more into our awareness, we intuit that we can access something else, something higher, something bigger, and set out, like the Buddha did, to find it. So she starts by talking that we're dealing with our belief in a reality that is not true and that we are going to set about to ascend and transcend. So then in the second chapter, she names what it is that we're looking for, conscious union with God. And who is God? God is all there is. God, she says, is spirit, with a capital S, spirit, or the creative energy that is the cause of all visible things. God is spirit, is the invisible life and intelligence underlying all physical reality. In that same chapter, she talks about who we are as human beings. Each human being, she says, remember, this is her quote, the last and highest manifestation of divine energy. We are the highest manifestation of divine energy. Did you know that? Did you remember that this morning? We are the fullest and most complete expression or pressing out, God pressing out into manifest reality of God. To man, therefore, to human beings, therefore, is given dominion over all other manifestations. Dominion over manifestations. So as projections are offspring of spirit, I like that. We are projections or offspring of spirit. We comprise three dimensions, she says, body, soul, and spirit. And each of those dimensions operates with its own intelligence or competence. And the goal here is by integrating these seemingly separate domains, we arrive at spiritual understanding. Because all of our life experiences, from the moment we wake up to being aware that we're alive, somewhere around the time 3, 4, 5, some people a little bit later, some people a little bit earlier, but some point early in our lives, we wake up to being aware of ourselves. So all of our life experiences, from that moment that we waken to self-awareness, seem to confirm our initial pre-mental, pre-conscious belief in the primacy of the world of flesh. That is the world that we were born into. And because we are programmed to believe, human beings are believing machines, we find that our reasoning mind, which St. Paul calls the mind of the flesh, starts its journey. This reasoning mind, when we wake up, starts its journey already in consciousness of error. And we have no choice in this. Every one of us is born into the world of the flesh, which is the world of the consciousness of error. So to overcome this built-in obstacle, she taught us in chapters 4 and 5 to apply denials and affirmations. Denials, remember, confront our embedded assumptions about ourselves, about our world, and about God by bluntly negating thoughts arising from error consciousness. Affirmations then replace that which we banished by denials with statements of the condition we seek to enjoy, with statements of our unity with God, our oneness with God. And last week we took a closer look at what Dr. Katie says is the primary role of faith, in the chapter entitled Faith, in reinforcing the activities that are initiated by the applications of denials and affirmations. We saw that we cannot not believe, we have to believe, and that we must access our intuition, not our minds, our intuition, which is, as she says, the activity of spirit within, rather than our mortal mind with its reliance on logic, for ever greater assurance, not mental assurance, experiential assurance, that we are deepening our conscious contact with God within. We also saw the role of desire in the activity of faith. Creation out of the invisible substance, Dr. Katie tells us, requires first that we identify what we want, and second, that we ask for it to come into being. Like I said earlier, no asking, no manifesting. And what we ask for comes out of our desire, which is God's desire planted in the soul. So to take these two steps, Dr. Katie affirms, is to act by understanding our conscious faith. Remember, she makes the distinction between blind faith and conscious faith. So the second half of the book will now take us into a much deeper, much closer experience of our deepest desires. As Dr. Katie puts it, our deepest desires for, quote, a new birth into a higher life, into spiritual consciousness. What we crave, she says, is more of good. And in parentheses, she puts God. Good God. She makes the same conflation of good and God that Emma Curtis Hopkins continuously does. Why? For all good is God, she says. So we focus our practice on those activities that move us from belief in bondage of the flesh to an ever more permanent state of spiritual understanding, which I love this, Dr. Katie calls spiritual understanding the flash of the Most High within your consciousness. We ask God to move us from blind faith to understanding or conscious faith. And she's going to devote chapter 8 to exploring this new world engendered by our coming into understanding or conscious faith. But before we take a deeper dive into this, we're going to look at chapter 7 entitled Personality and Individuality. And I thought, when I was thinking about this talk, I thought, under spiritual understanding, that's where the meat is. So I'm just going to gloss over chapter 7. Wrong. There's no glossing over anything Dr. Katie has to share. So as I looked at more closely at my notes on chapter 7, I realized there's some really, really profound information in there for us. But first of all, in the edition that we're using, or that I'm using, I should say, the Centennial Edition, it says, the title of the chapter is actually Definition of Terms, Chemicalization, Personality, and Individuality. That's why I thought we could gloss, definition. I'll just say what the definitions are, and then we'll go into chapter 8. But then I started to realize there's some powerful insights here. And remember when we started this talk, or this investigation in early January, part of what I sought to share with us is a sense of where Dr. Katie was coming from in the moment, in the early 1890s, as a result of her life experiences as a holistic medical practitioner, coming into contact with Emma Curtis Hopkins, and through Emma Curtis Hopkins with the Fillmores, and how the Fillmores were so impressed by her understanding that they invited her to share her thoughts with those that were just coming into the awareness of the Unity practice. And remember, Unity started, the School of Unity started in 1889. So it's only 3 years later that Dr. Katie is starting to get the publication of what became Lessons in Truth into Modern Thought magazine. So all of this is happening in a very concentrated period of time. So I was thinking about that. Why did she feel the need to create a chapter called Definitions? And it came to me that there is so much going on in such a concentrated period of time, at that time, that there were competing understandings of what we now call New Thought. And different people were using the same word to maybe mean different things. So she wanted to make sure that as we read through her book, that we had the understanding that she had, because she's going to continue to use certain words. So this is what really blew my mind as I thought about this. It's only 13 years from the establishment of the first New Thought church, Mary Baker Eddy's Church of Christ Scientists in Lynn, Massachusetts, established in 1879. It's only 7 years from the time Emma Curtis Hopkins broke with Mary Baker Eddy to go form her own theological institution in Chicago. It's only 4 years from the beginning of the second New Thought Church, the Home College of Divine Science, founded by Melinda Kramer in San Francisco, just down the road. So only 4 years from that to the publication of the first installment of Lessons in Truth. So 13 years from First Church of Christ Scientists to Lessons in Truth. Melinda Kramer, Emma Curtis Hopkins, and others are all out speaking and sharing what they're understanding about all this. Of course, the Fillmores are in the mix too. So no wonder it's an attempt by Dr. Katie to bring some clarity to the usage of these terms. So for the individual who's just starting to learn about this stuff, it could get confusing. You're reading Mary Baker Eddy, you're reading M. Curtis Hopkins, you're listening to lectures by their students, as the Fillmores did, to come in contact with these thoughts. So it makes sense to me why it is she wants to take some time to establish what she means, because she's writing in the first decade where there's this explosion of enthusiasm and joy about the discoveries of New Thought. And it also occurred to me, that's just the way New Thought is, that now 130 years later, there's still no single text that New Thought students read. A lot of people read Ernest Holmes, Science of Mind. Of course, we have our text, and a lot of people are still reading Mary Baker Eddy's, Science and Health, Keys of the Scripture. So there's many, many texts that can bring us information and insights into New Thought. So you can just imagine the challenge that she experienced as she's trying to explain what she means with these words. So she's taking time. I realize, actually, she takes time throughout the entire book to define her terms. It just happens in this chapter she uses that term. So she wants to clarify what she means about these three terms: chemicalization, personality, and individuality. What I realize, again, is reading through the chapter, that she's doing more than just offering definitions. She's teaching. She's using these words to bring us deeper and closer to where we're going to be at the end of Lessons in Truth, which is with the experience of the divine fully established in our consciousness. So chemicalization. Chemicalization is a great and now totally neglected word, loaded with useful insights about what happens to our bodies and minds when we take on the practice of denials and affirmations in our determination to break through to spiritual understanding. I think I can remember one time Phil Pearson talking about chemicalization in my time at Christ Unity, but this is a word that isn't used very frequently in our work. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but let's look what she says. So she says that after we have been living with our earlier beliefs for so many years, our bodies, quote, become solidified in wrong belief. Our bodies become solidified. This is a solid experience that we're having. Then when we take on transformation by diligent recitations of denials and affirmations as we are trained now, here's what she says. The very newness of it, and because it is truth, creates in the first few days new hope, new joy, and health. And after a little time, a sort of mental ferment or agitation takes place. One is apt to feel very nervous and seared way down to the depths of himself. But the enemy is wily. The old belief system based on error consciousness will not give up easily. She says, the old desires and habits will take possession of him with new force. All the new beliefs that lifted him up for a few days will seem like failures. And he seems on the very verge of breaking up generally. What has happened, she asks. Why, simply this. There has been a clash between the old condition, which was based on falsehood, fear, and wrong ways of thinking, and new thought or truth entering into you. The old mortal is kicking vigorously against the truth. You have a feeling of discouragement or a fear, a feeling such as one would have if caught at something disreputable. Do not be frightened, she urges. Something higher and better will always result. So this state of internal aggravation is what she calls chemicalization. And although she doesn't say much about it beyond this definition section, she is nonetheless implying something really important. She implies that our initial false belief systems do not reside merely in the mortal mind, as St. Paul says, but are in fact stored in our bodies as emotional, chemical, electrical impulses and structures. In fact, we're living in a belief about that we now call error consciousness 3 or 4 years before our mental capacities are even lighted up. We're living in belief as our emotional body is becoming formatted long before our mind gets a crack at explaining to itself what's going on, much less forming an organized set of beliefs about it. So the result of this pre-mental emotional experience with reality, eventually transferring itself to a mental perspective, is literally that bondage to the flesh and things of the flesh that Dr. Katie starts the book with. Our error thinking lives in and as a physiological reality. It's not simply mental. It starts out physiological. Now here's what's interesting. The centennial edition of this book states in a footnote that Dr. Katie's 6 paragraphs on chemicalization have been in and out of various earlier editions of the book. Footnote, all editions of Lessons in Truth since 1942, with the exception of the 1967, 71, and 72 editions, did not include this material on chemicalization. It had been thought, note the use of the passive voice, it had been thought. By whom? I don't know. It had been thought of as too negative and confusing. We are returning it with 19th century flavor because many people experience the phenomenon by whatever name it is called, and would benefit by reading, I'm squinting to read here, by reading about it. So, since 1942, that's just 6 years before Charles Fillmore dies, somebody in the Unity publishing world decided this stuff about chemicalization isn't valuable, it's too confusing. I disagree. There's been a tendency in Unity over the years, as we talked about when we talked about denials, to downplay the role of denials in deference to affirmations. And there is, of course, in our world, something's been happening. We baby boomers are responsible for happy talk and happy thinking, and we just want to focus on the happy stuff and pretend that the negative stuff and the darkness isn't there. Not by denying it in the way that Dr. Katie teaches us, but by pretending that it's not there. And this is shocking to me. This ambivalence in our movement is shocking to me because every one of us experiences chemicalization as we struggle for transcendence. And even some of us in Unity 401 still struggle with this belief that resides in our minds that this transcendence, this unity with God, this oneness is not real. This is interesting to me. Research into the relationship between error thinking and the physiology of the human emotional mind, it may not have been available to those who were studying New Thought at that period of time, at the end of the 19th century. But on the other hand, remember, Dr. Cady was developing a holistic body-mind approach to medicine. And certainly both Dr. Cady and Charles Fillmore were aware of the role of the subconscious in the development and maintenance of our beliefs. And they may have come to at least a preliminary hypothesis that our subconscious emotional defense systems predate mental belief systems. I find it interesting, again, think of the history of the time. What else was going on in scientific inquiry in America at that time? William James. William James is the founder of American psychology, who's a pioneer in the study of it here in this country, published his textbook, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890, a year after the founding of the Unity School and 2 years before the beginning of the publication of Lessons in Truth. So this, again, contemporary, New Thought is developed contemporary with that inquiry into the mechanics of human psychology that had begun in Europe but was picked up in the United States at the same time New Thought was developing by William James and his contemporaries. That led to, within 20 or 30 years, actually Freud was already doing this in the 1890s, the studies of Freud and Jung and their contemporaries into the mechanisms of consciousness, subconsciousness, the unconscious. So all of this stuff was happening before, or the results of those inquiries were not available in explicit scientific research terms to Dr. Cady, but Charles Fillmore, who lived until the late 1940s, was bringing this information into his work later on. So I mentioned to you during the announcements about Jesus Christ Heals, and Jesus Christ Heals, Charles Fillmore reveals a more nuanced understanding of the power of the subconscious. He calls the subconscious realm the storehouse of past knowledge and past experiences. So the subconscious is where the error consciousness lives in our storehouse of past knowledge and past experience. So I think safe to say we certainly know a lot more about the operation of human consciousness now. As I mentioned last week in my summary of the first 6 chapters, we are programmed from the start to believe. And so belief is active long before we can even form mental images of what believe. What Dr. Cady observes in the instances of backlash against the progress of conscious truth is now something we know to be inevitable and to be an immovable, non-removable element of our growing experience with the indwelling Christ. There will always be pushback from error consciousness. So that led me to this insight. This is not something Dr. Cady said, this is something I'm saying. But we can understand chemicalization as the way our human bodies experience that which the death and resurrection of Jesus the Christ represents metaphysically. We are dying to an earlier internal configuration, which we had to believe, we had no choice but to believe, error consciousness, bondage to the things of the flesh, and we are now ascending into an entirely radically different and more profound consciousness. No wonder our bodies and emotions rebel. Think of a snake shedding its skin, or think of what's the thing before the butterfly? Thank you, the caterpillar, going through the chrysalis stage and struggling to get out of that and spreading its wings. That's the experience we have. It's a physical experience. It's not merely mental. Everything Dr. Cady is seeking to teach us is to tell us not to trust the mind as we go through this process. The mind is going to do what it's going to do because it's trained to do that. So she points that out as she moves on to looking at the distinction between human personality and individuality. Personality, she says, she's furthering her definition of terms, applies to the human part of you, the person, the external. Jung would call it the mask. It is the outer, changeable man in contradistinction to the inner or real man. Individuality, she says, is the term used to denote the real person. The more God, comes into visibility through a person, the more individualized he becomes. Remember, she says, God is wisdom, intelligence, love, power. The more pronounced the manner in which any of those qualities, or all of them, comes forth into visibility through a man, through a person, the greater his individuality. One's individuality, then, is that part of one that never changes its identity. It is the God self. And how do we cultivate individuality? We cultivate by listening to the still, small voice deep down within us and boldly following it, even if it does make us different from other people, as it surely will. We cultivate personality, on the one hand, she says, in which live pride, fear of criticism, and all manner of selfishness, by listening to the voices outside ourselves and being governed by selfish motives, that is, motives of the personality, instead of by the highest within us. Seek always to cultivate, she urges, or bring into visibility individuality, not personality. In proportion as one increases, the other must decrease. So we might say that the work we are engaged in here as true students is the progress from personality to individuality. The more you learn to act from the still small voice within you, she declares, the stronger and more pronounced will be the individuality within you. And then she concludes this chapter with what is to me one of the most astonishing, amazing, and radical statements that we can say about the relationship between us humans and God. Always remember, she says, that God has need of you, through whom in some special manner to manifest. God has need of us in some special manner to manifest God, to manifest himself, itself, herself. Some manner for which he cannot use any other organ. She says, however humble your place in life, however unknown to the world you may be, however small your capabilities may seem at present to you, you are just as much a necessity to God in his efforts to get himself into visibility as is the most brilliant intellect, the most thoroughly cultured person in the world. Remember this always and act from the highest within you. God didn't just create us. He needs us. How does our mind wrap around that? I don't believe that. So what Dr. Katie is inviting us is to feel that truth. Feel this within. God needs me. There is no manifestation without us. This forms the basis for what she's going to share with us in the next chapter on spiritual understanding. This is the love relationship that we worked on experiencing on our Valentine's Day lesson a couple Sundays ago. God needs me. God loves me. God has no choice but to delight in me because he crafted me. He crafted you. He crafted you to be a special, unique, unrepeatable expression of himself. Each one of us was designed as this unique flash of the Most High, as Dr. Katie says, flash of God. No one else can be the God that each one of us can be. I think that's very, very profound. Logic will never grasp this nor accept this truth. So the affirmation for this chapter is, I am growing in confidence as an individualized expression of God. I am growing in confidence as an individualized expression of God. Would you repeat that with me? I am growing in confidence as an individualized expression of God. I'm growing in confidence as an individualized expression of God. So, divine presence, I don't know how this works. I'm committed to going deeper into these lessons in truth, so I don't need to know intellectually. I don't need to know rationally, but I choose to experience the truth that you need me as much as I need you. And in that relationship, that love will be born anything that we choose to create together. Thank you, God. Amen.